I'm also the New College Food Systems Coordinator, which means that I bring together scholarship, students, and community around food issues here on campus. And tonight's program has been sponsored by the New College Equity Studies program, the New One program. We have support from the Principal's Innovation Fund for tonight, and we're doing this also in collaboration with the Center for Sustainable Food Systems at Wilfrid Laurier University. And in fact, tomorrow we're going to be presenting the same panel at Wilfrid Laurier University. And just to add to it, you may notice one of our speakers is not here. He is on Skype, Joseph Leblanc. There's a good reason for that. He's in Thunder Bay at Lakehead University. He was going to be joining us, but he and his wife are about to have a baby. It was a little too close for him to be coming to Toronto, so we thought it would be great to have him via Skype, and we worked out, hopefully, all the technical glitches with this. So Joseph took advantage of this opportunity that he was going to be presenting from Thunder Bay to also organize an event at Lakehead University. So we also have a group of people at Lakehead who will be joining us and seeing what's going on here as we'll be watching the presentation there. Are you hearing me there in Thunder Bay? I just realized I'm speaking without a microphone.
Yeah, we could do this time.
Okay. So first of all, before we get started, I'd like to tell you about two students who put a lot of time and energy into organizing this event. I'd like to thank them both very much. They are Laura Sorreo and Nicole Davis, and you'll see them darting around over the evening. Nicole is going to be taking photographs of the evening, and Laura is working the video camera, because this event will be posted on the New College website and YouTube channel. So I also hope you've had a chance to get yourself a coffee or tea and some snacks. Snacks have been provided by FoodShare Toronto, and we're very excited to have them providing the food because it's always such high quality, and it's a social enterprise for FoodShare, which you'll be hearing more about in just a few minutes from Utcha. There are also a number of food-related groups here from the University of Toronto and the larger community with information tables tonight. So if you haven't already done so, please take a moment at the end of the evening to stop by the tables and say hello to people and find out a little bit more about what's happening in the community around food. So I think it's quite auspicious that this event is happening here at New College, because New College is known for its equity studies program. And this is an interdisciplinary approach to social justice, theories and practice on both local and global levels. We have three areas of emphasis in the program: disability studies, social advocacy, and the most recent addition is food studies. And I think it's really important that food studies is within an equity studies program. We need to shine that lens, that equity lens, on food issues. Equity issues, of course, include issues around gender, class, income level, ability, and of course race. And all of these issues are also very important around food justice as well. The other thing about food studies is that as a discipline, we've been incredibly fortunate to have a lot of practitioners in the community who have really been taking the lead on looking at issues around equity and food justice. And in fact, I would say they've been ahead of the academic world and often ahead of government as well in dealing with these issues. And so therefore, I'm very, very pleased to say that we have three practitioners here with us tonight. These are all people who have been in the trenches, developing programming, working with low-income communities, working on all of these issues where it actually hits the ground. And they've been doing a lot of thinking about this, as well as a lot of work on these issues. So I would like to welcome Utcha Sawyers from Toronto, Malik Yakini, who is visiting us from Detroit, and Joseph Leblanc from Thunder Bay. And each speaker is going to give a presentation of about 20 minutes, and then there will be lots of time for questions afterwards. So in order to get the most technically challenged part of the evening out of the way, we're going to start with Joseph, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed everything works well. I know you're going to enjoy his presentation. Joseph Leblanc is a founding board member and president of the True North Co-operative, which is a non-profit community-based cooperative in Thunder Bay, Ontario, aimed at building community resilience in Northern Ontario through a stronger localized economy. He works to improve security for Ontario's Northern Indigenous population and also to promote the diversity of food available in the North, and that includes forest foods and freshwater foods. And Joseph is also a member of the Sustain Ontario Advisory Committee. Here's Joseph Leblanc.
Okay, thank you all very much. I just wanted to Indigenous Learning Canada University for Policy here in Lincoln, and Kuwait Nago who is going to connect us tomorrow from Waterloo with remote communities.
Joseph, can you
yes.
talk a little more directly into the microphone? We're having a little bit of difficulty making out what you're saying.
Okay,
thanks.
so yeah, I want to give just a brief overview. We were asked to talk a little bit about who we are as individuals and why we do this work and where we come from. And so, I was born and raised in Northern Ontario. I consider myself a Northern Ontarian. I'm a descendant of British settlers as well as sovereign Adawa people in Northern Ontario. Our territory expanded very much throughout Northern Ontario and North America. And I put up this map. Generally, I like it. It has a lot of communities on it. It's missing most First Nations, and this is typical of what we see. But I do want to sort of root us in history and where we came from. In Canada, we very much are all treaty people. This is a very common map that I have here, and I'm sure most of you know where you lie within this. And if you don't, I'd encourage you to search it and look and read the content of your treaty and understand what those rights that exist are. Treaty rights are often relate solely to Indigenous peoples, but a lot of people at that perspective that Canada was founded on those relationships. These were treaties signed between sovereign nations and really put the groundwork in place to establish a country called Canada and the province of Ontario and those regulations that stem from that. And that's a lot of what we'll be talking about tonight is some of those challenges and barriers and what we've done to address them. So one of the things that I like to start with is this discussion of where food insecurity comes from in First Nations. Right? We tend to focus on the outcome of these actions and talking about high rates of diabetes or childhood obesity and heart disease, and look at them in isolation under the colonial context of where we are now, and look to build structures that address some of those challenges within that framework. So we see things like food subsidies that are meant to encourage people to buy more market-based foods in isolation from the fact that those are out for the companies that are selling it and really have very negative impacts on people. So as we look through these deliberate impositions that created the state of food insecurity, through contact and trade, Indigenous nations were exposed to a different way of interacting with each other. Right? This concept of reciprocation that existed and a mutual responsibility in Indigenous communities was met with this extractive perspective of the settler communities. And so as we look at how the economy exists today, we're talking about some of the impacts of that, and we hear broken promises and the assumptions that were made on both sides being broken over time. And so, this really first contact not only traded goods, but also traded perspective and changed the worldview of Indigenous people. Great. The Act for Gradual Civilization of Indians, we still deal with the Indian Act today. Its original name was the Act for Gradual Civilization of Indians. And a lot of those same principles still exist within it. So you may have heard some of this a little more discussion over, eradicating the Indian Act or changing it or doing something, and the response coming from the federal government being that it's a tree that's too deeply rooted in our past. But really, a lot of those intentions that were in that act were not removed when the name was changed. Right? So one of those sections which was put in 1882 was the restriction of Indians, which were in the prairies, of selling produce to non-Indian peoples. So, when we look at what that did fundamentally at that time, when Indigenous populations were well settled within the Western Canada and the prairies, and well positioned to succeed in agriculture, their marginalization from the general economy through restrictions like that section of the Indian Act really puts people at a disadvantage, right? And we carry forward that to today and look at those communities. And often the question is asked, why can't you pull yourself up by the bootstraps or participate in this economy when the foundation of that relationship was marginalization of Indigenous populations and Indigenous actors in this economy. The Constitution Act put Indigenous people in a separate jurisdiction from a lot of the resources that they were to be accessing. And so the delineation of natural resource management, for example, into provincial jurisdiction, while Indians and lands reserved for Indians were falling under federal jurisdiction, today causes a huge divide in who the forest is being managed for, as an example. Looking at the treaties and the reserve system, the treaties were, like I said, were set up to establish the country of Canada, to cede title from Indigenous people to the British Crown, and in that process, following that perspective of extraction and differing views of property rights. We now come to basically live on little islands that are a separate jurisdiction, and crossing an imaginary line into another jurisdiction and maintaining some right to be able to access those resources. So there's a lot of conflict that comes through that, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But the reserve system really was a holding place for Indigenous peoples. Right? It was a place that was meant to be a step along a transition towards what was seen as a civilized society. Right? We lived dispersed amongst the land and able to express mobility rights and access to where they were available. When the reserve system came in and people were forced to live static in one place, that changed that dynamic. And we see that now there are cases where people are wanting to build new trapping cabins in specific areas and having them tell them they can't, or that they should be building it somewhere else. And really that ability to produce food in a fluid manner and move along this landscape has had significant impacts in reducing the role of primary producers in the communities. And having primary producers supply the communities was one of the foundations of how healthy communities were built in the past. Residential schools, I feel like we could talk all night about the impacts of the residential schools, but in relation to food, the separation of children from their families and the inability to experience, learn, and participate in food production activities, witness people be productive members of their community and participate in the local economy was lost when children were removed from their families. When they went back, they were taught of a different world and put back into Indigenous society. Specifically, we've seen a lot of, particularly elders that have a negative sense memory in relation to food production, particularly gardening. Gardens were used as punishment in the residential schools. We have some signs from residential schools that would say, an hour in the garden, hard labor in the garden for specific infractions, going all the way up to 4 hours for expressions of culture and use of language. So where we would assume, participation in gardening is a very positive experience and positive for physical and mental health, and should have been modeled in a way where parents or grandparents are sharing that positive experience. Food production through gardening was used as a tool for punishment, and so logically those individuals didn't take that up of their own accord to do that at home. Having that negative sense memory of doing that has provided a barrier for what used to happen quite regularly in communities. The oligopolization of the imported food market, it's often wrongly termed a monopoly. There are several actors that are at play within that, including transportation industries and trucking companies, airlines. And this oligopolistic system really is set up to extract wealth and concentrate profit and power and external interests. So probably the best example of this is the Northern Store. The Northern Store is owned by the Northwest Company. It's a very publicly traded company and is owned by shareholders. The company is therefore required to maximize profit as much as they can, and they do. We have food prices that in some cases are 2 or 3 times higher than you would see in places like Thunder Bay or Ottawa, and that system that creates ill health is often where tweaks are attempted to be made, right? So people are diagnosed with diabetes or with HIV/AIDS. They're required to take a particular medication. They're required to eat a particular diet. They can't do that within the system that caused some of those diseases, right? And so this often now results in people leaving their communities, people leaving remote communities because they've been diagnosed with a condition that they simply can't manage their diet in a remote community. This further fragments the communities, but it also is something that will not be fixed with Indigenous focused food guides or the latest Dietitians of Canada cookbook for diabetes, right? If you can't access those foods, you can't change your diet, you can't realize that health outcome. So the last one here is mass media, and this is something that is all of these we're seeing the impacts now, but mass media is one that's changing the communities very quickly. The introduction of cell phones, for example, into remote First Nations, an initiative funded by the federal government, is introducing iPods and iPhones and other things to the youth, and they're able to access basically everything that we are in Thunder Bay or Toronto. And so that, what we've heard from people, when kids come out in for a hockey tournament to Thunder Bay or Dryden, they want to go to McDonald's, they want to go to Pizza Hut, they want to go to these things that they see on TV and are advertised to them. But also is the encouragement of those things into remote communities. So we now have 5 KFCs in Northern Ontario in remote communities. If you've driven by a KFC in the city, this permeates the local area. So you go into a remote community of 400 people and there's a KFC. That's one of the things that you can smell at all times. And so this encroachment of mass media and this mass food system into remote communities is further impacting health and very much in the position of the state of food insecurity. So really, when we talk about these food systems, I really feel the place of exclusion that we deal with most firsthand is natural resource management. The natural resource management regime used to be focused on timber and very much still is, with a spin for social and ecological values as well. But the structure that we have in place in Ontario leaves the forest management units in the hand of the extractive industries, right? So we have timber companies or paper companies managing our forest land bases, and they're being asked to manage for the values of other users. In other jurisdictions, they've addressed this with community forestry, or they've addressed this with management boards that are at arm's length from industry. So far, our attempts at forest tenure reform in Ontario have mainly changed terminology, provided still a framework for those dominant and extractive industries to continue their management of the forest. So I have here a couple pictures taken from the surrounding area. A tree plantation on the top left. A herbicide spraying sign, which basically comes out every blueberry season. Where this is spraying is fairly coarse data, right? We know generally where it's going to happen, but at the stand level, not necessarily communicating. And when communities express concern with spraying during the season, it's often argued against and saying that this is in favor of stock trees or in favor of economic growth or the economy of Northern Ontario, ignoring the fact that food comes out of there. So you see some of the impacts of sites that were sprayed this year, or that year that this picture was taken, and some of the rutting that happens in the forest industry, something that needs to be avoided, but certainly you see scars on the landscape like So when we start to look at economic development as a concept, and what I was seeing in starting to work in this industry, I came from forest conservation. I came at it very much from the background in food production. My grandfather farmed and produced food in Mickey and lived in a system where he shared his food with family and had that extended support come back and ready to see people share things during a time of abundance when corn was ready, when see that corn shared, but at Christmas time food would be dropped off back. And it wasn't something that was accounted for. It was what we would call that sharing economy, or cooperative economy. And so looking at the way that the forests were being managed, what economic development was being pushed on our communities, came to understand economic development as the most active form of assimilation in Canada now. The transition of Indigenous communities away from shared cooperative economies hasn't stopped. We see a lot of material come from government agencies and others that say promote entrepreneurship or promote this private enterprise, which will ultimately end up in that accumulation of accumulation of wealth and private interests. So very much understanding it as a zero-sum game. I'll use the example of the wood supply allocations. So a few years ago, the government of Ontario had a number of cubic meters available that wasn't being used, and they hold a competitive process to do that. It sounds fair, but what ends up happening is we have multiple First Nations bidding against each other for access to wood on shared land. And that access is granted by provincial interests. So, we have one community putting in a proposal with an industrial partner and the next community putting in another proposal. The problem with zero-sum games is somebody loses. So one community doesn't get access and one community does get access. And they're able to thrive or build a business and the other is left with nothing. So that cooperative principle of access, shared access to resources, shared access to opportunities is completely destroyed by that approach of allocating to the best bid or to the best contractor, to what the government wants to see people acting in a particular manner. So we experience boom and bust cycles in this region and really are seeking sustainability, seeking something that allows for that shared opportunity to be realized. What we see here, this is a picture from the restricted access of Oakey Forest. Oakey Forest is north of Lake Nipigon if you're looking at a map, and it's restricted access, so you have to seek permission if you're not a status Indian to be in that forest. This is not uncommon to see. These are cut and scaled logs that were never picked up by the company. So the local contractor, First Nations contractor, cut these logs, pulled them to the side, and they were ready to be picked up. The company went under, bankrupted, closed their mill. This wood was never picked up, the contractor was never paid, and it might as well be standing. Right? We have this system set up where we have a forest alive on the side of the road being eaten by beetles without it being harvested or accounted in that way. It probably won't be replanted. And in that structure, the community members that harvested that wood are left with nothing. The company that didn't pay that bill or went bankrupt was also recently just forgiven of their outstanding loans and grants to the Ontario government, as well as over $20 million in stumpage fees that the province was just recently forgiven. So there certainly is a balanced distribution of profit and gain within this relationship. The community that lives there that will be accessing moose from that area, that hopes to pick blueberries in that area, has a forest line on the side of the road, and they have nothing they can do about it. So this balance is something that we sought to correct. And in looking at this, I came across this concept of life projects. This book here, In the Way of Development, is a collection of discussions of these Indigenous life projects and the discussion of, is it and industrial development or industrial development or versus industrial development, and how Indigenous communities will have built these life projects with and around and against industrial development by external actors. It's available for free online, so if you're interested, Google it and take a look. There's a lot of really great stuff in there. So moving forward with this concept of life projects, in 2006 I started working with Dr. Brian on some relationship with Amarillo First Nation and looking at what it was they were interested in. And naively I come looking for a specific project that I had in mind and looking at caribou and their habitat, and immediately basically the community said we're not interested in caribou because we've been prevented from hunting them for decades, right? And the knowledge that people were sharing was really good. It was very old knowledge about where they had shot caribou in the past or seen them in the past. And we started to hear things like, everyone we see has collars, or when they become or someone shot it. So we started to look at 4 streams, and one that the community was very interested in was this concept of marketing non-timber forest products. The community had a significant supply of blueberries. We started to look at what it is that the community wanted to do with that, and those concepts of shared opportunity, shared wealth, kept coming up, right? And so in talking with community members and exploring this idea of what is Indigenous economic development, we set up the Blueberry Depot as a nonprofit depot. Pickers are paid a fair price. The pickers have a say in what that price is. We started in 2008. In the first year, we had about $10,000 sales. We were the first depot there. This past year, there were 5 depots in the community, so people see that opportunity and they open up and they start buying from pickers. And there's a balance in price, and it really is quite something. And so this year, this past year, 2013 summer, 5 depots got together and estimated that their value was at $4 million. So we have a community of 350 to 500 people generating that kind of economic activity within a season that's 4 to 6 weeks long, and really providing new opportunities for youth. This young guy in the corner did some work for us at the co-op this year, and he was in town. He was an active picker, but at 16 years old, he didn't really remember a time there wasn't a idea. So, it doesn't take long until people start to identify and know how to run it. We were very deliberate in involving youth in buying and selling and packing and distributing blueberries. So now in northwestern Ontario, Maryland blueberries can be found pretty well in every farmer's market throughout the region. I should say as well that the youth use their end of the profit to benefit in the community. So for the past 3 years, they've chartered a bus and bought tickets for the kids to go to Canada's Wonderland. So they went down each year at the end of the blueberry season, at the beginning of the school year, and went and celebrated their efforts and what they've done, and that's their choice. So out of that, I started selling blueberries and hustling around and trying to find a market that was viable and sustainable, and with the pickers, getting a fair price, and started interacting more and more with the agricultural community and hearing some of the same challenges. We would go to grocery stores, a chain store, and they'd say, well, no, we only buy from central office, or we only get from the food terminal, or they're not involved in buying at all. The local managers had no agency to say, yes, we'll take these berries. Smaller grocery stores were pushing the price up, right? And they said, well, I'll give you $15 a basket, and we had paid the picker 17 or whatever. So that there really was no control in the producer to get what they needed to be viable. And in talking with agricultural producers and standing beside the market and other things, this was a similar experience to people. So this concept of shared opportunity and social enterprise turned into what we had first called the Northern Ontario Food Production and Distribution Network, and after several community meetings came up with a much more focused name and concept, and developed a business plan, and in this in 2009, November, we incorporated True North Community Co-operative as a nonprofit mixed member co-op in Northern Ontario. So we say, we sell things from the lands and hands of Northern Ontario. Our producer members set their own prices, so they're able to protect what they need to be viable. And our consumer members, our individual members, are able to access goods that are produced in Northern Ontario from our storefront 6 days a week. In 2011, we were invited to Fort Albany First Nation to participate in their food security gathering, and heard very much that they were looking for a better supplier. They had asked us to apply to Nutrition North Canada. They were already running this great idea of this alternative market, and so we applied and were accepted. We are currently the only nonprofit southern supplier in the Nutrition North Canada program. In 2013, we shipped over 60,000 pounds of fresh fruits and vegetables to 5 First Nations who are running either student nutrition programs, food box programs, or alternative markets. And there's just an array of photos. We built a mobile market, and we're still developing that concept. But our trailer is going to be in the refrigerated, and we'll be able to access road access communities through that. We run a CSA, which is a cooperative community support agriculture program, for 12 weeks in the summer, and we've been doing that for 4 years now. Last year we had 50 share members and 11 participating producer members, including the Airline Sweet Blueberry Initiative. And we were really happy to receive the Premier's Award for Agri-Food Innovation Excellence this past year. So I want to kind of pull it all together. I gave some introduction of what it is we've been doing as far as research goes and actions, and talk about this concept of actionism. So, really following that saying, being the change you want to see in the world, right? I can see, we've seen activists take up the cause of food insecurity. We've seen protests, and for example, a year ago, there were protests across the Arctic North on the northern store. Unfortunately, that didn't change anything, right? And public shaming never changed anything, right? If you type in high prices in Northern Australia, you'll come up with countless articles that discuss this and bring it up and call for a change, but really you see no change because those structures are set up to accumulate wealth into private interests. So, we start talking about actionism as action-based activism, right? And this is that decolonization of the mind and the body. Looking at life projects and place-based education, right? Like I said, when kids were taken out of the communities and taught how to live in a different place, when they were returned back, this caused a lot of difficulty for them. And that place-based education and realizing that skills like hunting and trapping and how to skin an animal or clean a fish are life skills that are needed in Northern Ontario. They're life skills that are needed in remote communities. They're needed in order to provide food, turn resources that are around us into food that people can access. Social entrepreneurship, I think, is the closest thing we have in the Western definitions for what Indigenous economy was, right? And these are activities that are not profit-based as their driving principle, right? Our co-op is a nonprofit, our Blueberry Initiative is a nonprofit. That doesn't mean there isn't money exchanged. It just means that it's equally accessible and the opportunities are there for people to access it. I mean, it's not going, for example, into my pocket. I can show you that. And community organizing, intergenerational learning, and really community energy, right? So we often hear volunteerism and these types of words, but what we've done with these projects is to really turn what people were interested in doing, the direction that they wanted to go, putting energy behind that, helping people to organize and to realize that change that they want to see. And like I say, be the change that we want to see. So I'm going to end on these concepts of the 4 star strategies. So in looking at this and in sharing this with community members and in trying to position how is it that we move from such a state of insecurity and poor health and poor economic conditions to one where we're returning to that vibrant and healthy people that we once were. And so, starting with the reclaiming our identity, reclaiming the places that were lost, right? There's a great saying in mapping, right? Naming is claiming. And, we see places like Angling Lake return to Wapakika, right? And those returns and reclamation of the place that you live in, naming it to reflect the things that happened there, or the people that lived there, or the history and the rich environment around it is so critical. From there, moving on to reorganization. And I've given two examples, the Blueberry Initiative and the Co-op are examples of reorganizing ourselves in order to accomplish something that we see as a need, right? We're not telling someone else to reorganize themselves. We're doing it ourselves, right? And we're going to say, we want to get these blueberries to markets and find a way to reorganize the way that we're interacting with each other in order to do that efficiently. It takes time, and we will get there. But a critical piece after that is to reskill ourselves in order to participate in that reorganized system, right? If we don't know how to order blueberry baskets, then we find out how and we reskill ourselves in order to do that. Harvesting berries, for example, the community has organized vans that take people without vehicles out, right? Or the areas that are closer where people are walking are for elders and kids to access, right? And so how is it that we sort of provide these skills to participate in this reorganized system? And there's a lot of things that were done for those that aren't here. But Renata Timothy is here. She's an organic farmer close by, and she's been volunteering to participate in these gardening workshops that are very, very easy to do. We use the technology, video conferencing technology. People are able to connect every 2 weeks from the north with Renata and ask questions. It's not a workshop. We're not flying people in at great expense to run workshops on how to garden. We're not going and building gardens. People have to put the shovel in the ground for themselves. But in order to support that reskilling, the connection and building social relationships with people should be very, very welcoming to people to call or to come and visit if they're in town, and that's greatly appreciated. And those reorganizations and helping each other reskill is a critical part of this. And finally, rebuilding. I've come to understand, very much our system and how we interacted with each other is like an engine, right? It's still there. The pieces are still there. Some of them may not be functioning, but with some tweaking and some tightening, we can build that and we can function again, right? It's not lost. It's still there. The memory is still there of how to do this. And the experience is still there how to do this. The critical part, I think, is in that community energy, right? We've seen great ideas come and be funded, and they run for a little while, and they kickstart that engine, and there's a support program running for a little while, and the funding dries up and then stops again. So what is it that we're putting in there to drive that engine? How is it that we're keeping it functional and reskilling ourselves and contributing to that rebuilding of Indigenous sovereignty is so critically important. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I hope that Toronto's still there and everybody heard that.
Thanks so much. So I hope you understood that. I caught most of it. It was a little tricky, but I guess that it's pretty amazing that we're linked up with Thunder Bay right now in the first place. So thank you, Joseph. Our next speaker is Malik Yakini, who is here from Detroit. He is the executive director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. He is a second-generation Detroiter and a longtime Detroit activist, and he's played a key role in raising awareness about environmental and food justice issues in the city of Detroit over the last decade. And Malik gives a critical analysis of the history of race and racial injustice with some concrete activism and specific steps that need to be taken within the Black community, as well as in collaboration with community partners who share goals that are related to racial justice. So he has a very interesting presentation for us. Here's Malik.
Good evening, Toronto. How's everyone doing? And good evening, Joseph, and the folks who are there with you. Hope you can see us. I always like to start when I have a chance to talk before a group of people by first giving praise to the Creator, and not trying to impose my views on anyone, but for me, the work I do is a spiritual work, and so that's always at the foundation of what I do. And then also to give recognition to my ancestors, those who are in my personal bloodline and those who people of African descent collectively share. I also want to thank Lori for inviting me, and to her husband, Wayne Roberts, who has been an example in many ways, particularly as we were putting together the Detroit Food Policy Council. He took time to share with us some of the successes and challenges that were encountered here in Toronto with the Toronto Food Policy Council, which he headed for many years. And he also came to Detroit to speak to the Detroit City Council as we were trying to convince them of the benefits of putting together a food policy council. So I will be eternally indebted to Wayne for his support of our work in Detroit. It's also a pleasure once again to be with my sister Utcha on the panel, and to be with Joseph. We presented together, I think, in November in Windsor at the Good Food Matters? Bring Food Home conference, yes. And so it's a pleasure once again to be presenting with these two very progressive thinkers. So the title of this presentation tonight is What's Race Got to Do with It? And let me say from the outset that the concept of race is a social construct. It's not a biological reality. We have enough information now to know that human beings share millions of genes, and the genes that make us appear different one from the other are very few. And so we have much more in common with each other than we have different. And so the differences that we have are more cultural differences than they are biological differences. So although I'm going to be talking about so-called race, I want to begin by saying that it really doesn't exist, and that it is, again, a construct that's been created in order to control people and to divide people so that the 1% who is raking off profits of all of us can continue to do that. I want to talk specifically about the work that we're doing in Detroit, and in my conversation with Wayne earlier, about this idea of race, we were discussing that how race, so-called race, manifests in Canada is different than how it manifests in Detroit. So I want to say unapologetically that the views I have are shaped by my experience in Detroit and in the United States, which might be different from the experiences here in Toronto, which is a very multicultural city. Detroit is not really a multicultural city. Detroit is probably the blackest city in America. The population, according to the census, in 2010 was 83% African American. We have a small Latina population, and even smaller Asian population, and maybe 15% or so, 12 to 15% people who would identify as being white. So that frame of reference is perhaps very different than what you experience here in Toronto. So as you listen to me speak, just be aware that my experiences are shaped by my experience. I mean, my talk is shaped by my experience. So as Lori said, I'm the executive director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. And we started in 2006. And in some way, we started as a result of an experience that I had with my brother, Anan Laloli. Where's Zola, by the way? Is he still here? Where is he? Okay, he went to, because I want to big him up today, because in many ways, he's my teacher in this work. And if you don't know Anan, please make sure that you get to know him, because he's doing fantastic work here in Detroit and Toronto. In 2005, he asked me to co-present with him at a conference in Atlanta, Georgia, of the Community Food Security Coalition Conference. Excuse me, man. And incidentally, which is where I met Wayne Roberts. And at that conference of the Community Food Security Coalition, the issue of race was front and center as they were discussing how to bring greater food security and food justice to communities throughout the United States and Canada. And what I saw in Atlanta at that conference was reflective of the same thing I saw in Detroit, which is that throughout the United States, much of the work which is being done, which is called either food security work or food justice work or food sovereignty work, is being done in African American or Latino communities. But the work was and is largely being done by white-led nonprofits. And this creates a tremendous problem because all of us have internalized concepts that are associated with race, with racism specifically. And so for people who identify as being white, the concepts that are internalized are often concepts that have to do with feeling a sense of superiority and a sense of entitlement and a sense of privilege. And so when you have young whites who are coming into communities of color, who those young whites may be well-intentioned, but if they haven't gone through a process to divest themselves of the vestiges of this white supremacist tinged thinking, they often come into communities almost like missionaries, as if they have the answer for that community, not recognizing the inherent leadership which exists within all communities, not honoring the history of struggle which existed in those communities, and coming in with resources so that they become the permanent overlords over the people that they're trying to help. And so, again, I saw this was going on nationally, and this was being debated at the Community Food Security Coalition Conference in 2005, and the same thing was happening in Detroit. And so I came back from that conference convinced that the African American population in Detroit needed to organize itself to play a leadership role within the food security movement and to make sure that our voice was heard and was heard in a very pronounced manner. And so I called together several people in February of 2006 to form what is now called the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. And Brother Nala Loli, in fact, drove down from Toronto, was at our founding meeting. He's one of our founding members. And from the very beginning, our organization was controversial. There were many people in the city of Detroit that said, well, why does it have to have the name Black Food Security Network? Why can't it just be the Detroit Food Security Network? And many people shied away from us because of that. In fact, there were some black people who said, well, I can't be a part of that because it's got the name Black in it. And there were some white people who shied away from us because they thought we were racist in reverse. And so we said, fine, do what you do, we're going to do what we do. And so we started to build, and we began to advance this dialogue about the role of race within the food system and really about white supremacy in society in general. And people began to listen to our analysis, and many of those people who initially opposed us decided that maybe we weren't crazy after all, and that there was some validity to our analysis about the role that race played. And many of those who were young whites, in fact, began to look at their own behavior in a much more critical way. And so we have continued to build since February of 2006 and have had some impact on the food system work that's going on in the city of Detroit. In fact, some of those folks who initially opposed us, some of those young whites who thought that perhaps we were being racist in reverse, if such a thing were a possibility, began to embrace us and began to be much more intentional about how they were entering communities, so that they were entering communities not as missionaries or not as overlords, but they were trying to begin to enter communities as partners that empowered the members of the community in which they were working. So we had several purposes. I'm not going to go over all of them, but when we started, we were concerned about urban agriculture, because we think that given the food crisis that faces people throughout North America, that urban agriculture is an important part of the solution. It is not the solution, and certainly we don't think that urban agriculture is going to replace rural agriculture. We still need that. We're not going to have fields of wheat growing in Toronto, I don't think, right? And for those of you who consume animals, we're probably not going to have herds of cattle in Toronto or Detroit. So urban agriculture is not a replacement for rural agriculture, but it is certainly an important supplement. And as we see how the demographics in the world are changing, where the majority of the world's population now lives in urban areas, and also as we're faced with this crisis facing the environment, where huge amounts of carbon are being released into the atmosphere, it makes more sense to grow food closer to where populations are concentrated. And so for that reason, it's critical that urban agriculture be part of the solution as we're reshaping the food system. And so one of our initial purposes was to promote urban agriculture. A second purpose was to promote sound policy. Our organization believes in what we call self-determination, or what in Kiswahili we say, we call kujichagulia. Sister know it? Can y'all say kujichagulia? Only 2 people can say it. The rest of y'all can't say it. Oh, you don't want to say it? Don't be scared. Kujichagulia? Okay, that's a Kiswahili term, and it means self-determination. To define our own reality and to shape our own reality, and to really take back our humanity, to take back our human power to shape our own reality. And so, you know, our position is that people of European descent don't have a monopoly on shaping reality, that we have that same divine power within inside of us. And so, while we believe in that, and we don't believe that we should be dependent upon government or on the corporate sector, we also believe that the government should behave in a responsible manner. And so we think that it's important that to support and complement the efforts of self-determination by community members, the government should enact policy which benefits the common good. And so that was also one of our purposes. A third purpose was to promote young people being involved in food system change. In many ways, I'm a child of the 1960s and early 1970s. I'm an activist from back in those time periods, and I'm still standing firm on many of the principles that we stood firm on during that time period. But in some ways, we were naive during that time because we thought that really revolution was an event rather than a process. We thought that, you know, in 2-3 years, there was going to be a massive transformation, a massive shift in power in the Western world. And perhaps there was that possibility, actually, at that point in time, were it not for COINTELPRO and the massive repression that came as a part of the United States and its Western allies. But nonetheless, we were short-sighted because we didn't understand that this process of deep social change is a protracted process and an intergenerational process. So having learned that lesson, when we started the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network in 2006, we understood that we have to get young people involved in this because it is an intergenerational movement. We can't have all people with gray in their beards and gray in their hair who are running this movement. We need young people who are vibrant, who are bringing new ideas. That's also how change occurs, right? Because no matter how sincere we might be, we all get locked into our own perspective. So it's very important that young people are involved so that they can bring new life and fresh energy. So that was also one of our purposes. Another purpose was that we're concerned about not just the production of food, but we're concerned about how food is sold and distributed in our communities. And as I was listening to Joseph talk, he talked about the extractive economy, extracting wealth and concentrating property and power, I think were the terms that he used. And so, of course, we see the same thing in our community in the city of Detroit, the concentration of property and power and the extraction of wealth from our communities. And so we're not just concerned about making sure that our community has adequate amounts of healthy, culturally appropriate food, although that's critically important, but we're also concerned about how is that food accessed? Who sells it to us? Where do the profits from that food go? And so right now in the city of Detroit, we see the majority of those profits being sucked out of our community and going into the community of suburbs surrounding Detroit. And so in a sense, the African American community in Detroit is similar to a colony during the era of direct colonialism, where the mother country, the European mother country, would see the colony as being a market where they could dump cheap goods and extract profits. And so we push back very hard against that kind of paradigm. And so we think that within the context of a capitalist system, which is, let me say this also, that we are unapologetically anti-capitalist. We think capitalism is a bad system for human beings. But within the context of a capitalist system, we think that the best option that we have to build collective power and to galvanize that collective wealth is the cooperative model. And so one of our purposes early on was to build cooperatives and to support existing cooperatives. So we have 4 core programs that help us to reach our goals and to enact those purposes. And we have two things that we've started that aren't part of our core programs that I'll tell you about first before our core programs. The first is the Detroit Food Policy Council, and I kind of mentioned that in the introduction. I said that Wayne helped us with that, and Anand also came down and spoke in Detroit and helped us to shape the Detroit Food Policy Council. And in many ways, the Detroit Food Policy Council has been lauded as an example of a grassroots food policy council. There are many food policy councils where the members are appointed by the mayor, let's say. For example, in the city of Philadelphia, the mayor appoints all of the members of the Food Policy Council. And so what that means is that often the grassroots community doesn't have a real voice in helping to shape that policy. And so we structured the Detroit Food Policy Council in such a way as to make sure that grassroots Detroiters have a strong voice in shaping the development of policy and in the direction of that organization. So while we were the lead organization in birthing that, once it was birthed, we no longer owned it. In a sense, that was our gift to the people of the city of Detroit. A similar project, which is not part of our 4 core programs, is something called Uprooting Racism, Planting Justice. Because we understand and we believe very strongly that you can't have a just food system unless you address the issue of race. During the last century, the great African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois said that the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. And I think he was hopeful that as we entered into this new millennium that perhaps that problem would be resolved, but I would go so far as to say that that continues to be one of the great problems of the current century as well. And so without addressing racism, and specifically when we're talking about racism, we're really talking about the system of global white supremacy. Everybody good? I always have to, when I throw that term out, I just want to kind of take the temperature in the room, make sure everybody's good. Everybody all right? Okay. And there is this system of global white supremacy. I'll talk about it just a little bit more in a minute. But without addressing that, it's impossible to have a just food system. The reality is that you can't have food justice unless you have justice in society in general. The food system is not separate from the other institutions within society. And so the struggle to create justice within the food system is not separate from the struggle to create justice within society in general. And maybe I'll segue, I'm going to kind of turn my talk around a little bit and just kind of go with the flow and say that as we're looking at how we create justice within society, there's many evils in society that need to be addressed, but there's 3 big ones. There's 3 big evils. And one of them, 2 of them I've named already, actually. The first being capitalism. Capitalism is a system that by nature is exploitive. So we have people who are gaining massive amounts of profit, not by their own efforts or not by their own intelligence, but because they have exploited the labor and the ideas and the land and the resources of others. And so, again, we don't think that that's a good system for human beings. And in fact, I would predict that that system is slowly giving way to a system which is more equitable. It's hard to see because it's a very slow process, but throughout the world, people are beginning to realize that these systems that exploit people are not the systems that we need if we're going to have a world that survives. The second of these three big evils is the system of global white supremacy that I mentioned just a minute ago. And that manifests in many different ways, and it's related to the system of imperialism that has us standing here speaking English today, that has people whose ancestors came from various places in Europe, dominating this country, which is now called Canada, dominating the country, which is now called the United States. The fact that the Western powers are basically dominating the world militarily, culturally, politically, and economically, all that is tied into this system of white supremacy. And it's really upheld by military power. I mean, the reality is that when people came out of Western Europe and began to invade countries throughout the world and exploit their resources, the only way they were able to maintain that stranglehold is because they had military power, but then also, as in Joseph's presentation, he mentioned they colonized the minds of the people. And so those kind of two things work together, to subdue resistance to these systems of exploitation. The third of these big evils is patriarchy. And I like to own my own stuff and tell you that I am a reforming chauvinist. And many of us who were involved in the Black movement in particular, who were trying to develop a sense of our own manhood, developed that at the expense of women. And so having grown and being introspective and trying to be a just human being, I realized that it is impossible to have a society which is just if you're oppressing and underdeveloping half of the population. And not only but see, what this system of patriarchy does, it doesn't only underdevelop women, because men have feminine energy inside of us also. And so I can say in my own life, trying to be macho, what I was doing is suppressing my own feminine energy. I have a mother, right? I didn't just have a father, I had a mother and a father. So I got both of those energies inside of me. And the feminine energy gives us intuition and creativity and all of those things. So men can't be whole, right? While we're suppressing the feminine energy. And so the reality is that the planet can't heal. The planet can't heal. We can't be whole human beings if we are caught in this system of patriarchy that suggests that in some way men need to be over women, right? And that doesn't value and uplift the feminine energy. Y'all with me on that? So I want to really, challenge the men in the audience to really be introspective, just as I challenge white people to be introspective about white supremacy, men have to challenge ourselves also, right? And really look at how we're manifesting these concepts of patriarchy and really underdeveloping this very important energy that we need if the world is going to be a whole, sane place. So we can't have a fair, just food system unless we're addressing those three things: global white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. And so for us, again, the system, the struggle to create food justice and food security and food sovereignty in Detroit is not separate from the struggle to abolish those systems of oppression and to replace them with ways of relating which are more just and which honor the humanity of everyone. So in the couple of minutes I have left, I want to go through just a quick PowerPoint about our biggest program. And in fact, I told you I was going to tell you about our 4 core programs, so I'll do that very quickly. We have a youth program called the Food Warriors Youth Development Program, and I mentioned that, we understand this has to be an intergenerational movement. We need young people, so we're raising up young people from the age of 5 and teaching them about food justice and teaching them how to create school gardens and teaching them how to do analysis of the food options in their own community. But also, people of African descent have a particular issue that we have to deal with when it comes to this idea of growing food. And I've seen it in Detroit. I've talked to my brother Nan here in Toronto. He's seen it here. And that is that typically when young children of African descent come out to a garden and start doing work, within the first 30 minutes, we're going to hear some reference to slavery. You're working me like a slave. I thought slavery was over. Because that's the mindset that we have that we've developed. That's the lens through which we view agriculture work because of our historical experience. So for African people in the United States, we had the experience of enslavement, the experience of sharecropping and other forms of tenant farming, all of which were systems to exploit our labor to make the rich white landowners wealthy. And so many people of African descent are running as far away from that as they can. And so part of our work is to reframe agricultural work for people of African descent as being honorable work that builds a sense of self and builds a sense of self-reliance and self-determination. And so our youth program has all those objectives. We have a lecture series called the What's for Dinner lecture series, because we also understand that just providing access to high quality food is not enough in and of itself. In fact, I've had experiences with a garden, a school garden I was working with, and we had a neighbor who was letting us use her water. And so in appreciation for that, I took some beets over to her and some eggplants, as a gift. And she looked at him and she's like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? Right? Because we have a whole generation of people, perhaps 2 generations at this point, who have grown up on fast foods and convenience foods in the post-World War II period. And so the food knowledge and the food culture that perhaps our grandparents had has been diminished severely. And so part of building this just food system also has to address public education. We have to raise people's consciousness. So on one hand, we do have to provide greater access to healthy food choices, but on the other hand, we have to raise people's consciousness so that they understand the importance of incorporating those healthy food choices into their lives, and also so that they understand how to prepare those foods in a way which is tasty and delicious. Delicious shouldn't be underestimated, by the way, in the food movement, right? Delicious is important, I think. What do you think? Yeah, delicious is important. Just something being good for you, that's not good enough. It's got to taste good, too. Our third core program is a buying club that's called the Utcha Buying Club, Utcha Co-op Buying Club. And I mentioned earlier that we're concerned about this extractive economy where stores open up in our community who aren't owned by the population who lives in Detroit. And in the city of Detroit, again, which is 83% African American, 90% or more of the food stores in the city are owned by Chaldeans. Chaldeans are an ethnic minority from Iraq who are Christians in a majority Muslim country, by the way, who have a long history of entrepreneurship. And I'm not really mad at Chaldeans, but I'm mad at any group that comes into my community and exploits and extracts the wealth from that community. And then also, just like in a work situation where you have perhaps a supervisor who's a man and a beautiful young lady comes in and starts working at the job, and then he sees perhaps a way he can have his way with her because he's in a more powerful position. The same thing happens with communities of people. When you have a community coming into an exploited community and coming in a more powerful position, it creates a circumstance which is ripe for abuse. And so we see all kinds of abuses occurring in the city of Detroit on the part of these Chaldean store owners to the majority African American population. We have sexual abuse that occurs. We have verbal abuse that occurs to women. In fact, it's very common in the city of Detroit for an African American woman to go into a store to buy a loaf of bread and she's addressed as baby, sweetie, or honey. Okay, if you go in to buy a loaf of bread, you're not looking for a date, I don't think, right? And so, that level of disrespect has to be addressed. But that is also a function of these imbalances in power. And so the Utcha Co-op Buying Club is a way for members of our community to band together to buy food collectively in order to realize a discount on our food dollar by buying things in larger quantities. The American capitalist economy works on scale, and so as you buy larger and larger quantities, your discount becomes deeper and deeper. And so rather than every individual going to the store and buying a 4-pack of toilet paper, if we put our money together, we can buy a truckload of toilet paper and get it for the same price that the store is getting it from. So that's the principle that we're operating on. And now we're working on morphing this buying club into a brick and mortar cooperative grocery store. In fact, that's where the majority of my time goes right now. In the city of Detroit, as of 2007, the last national grocer in the city of Detroit closed its doors, which is called Farmer Jack. And so now we're left with this series of independently owned stores, which often are owned by Chaldeans. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not anti-Chaldean. That's not the point in saying this. But many of the stores sell food which is overpriced, which is sometimes expired, which has a second label over the expired label. Many times the sanitary conditions in the stores are less than desirable. And as I mentioned, many times the workers in the store speak to the members of the African American community in a way which is disrespectful. So we are working on creating this cooperative grocery store, which will be owned by members of the community. We expect it to open sometimes late in 2015. And I'll go through the rest of this presentation very quickly. Our biggest and most labor-intensive program is D-Town Farm. And we started that in 2006. We've had 3 locations. And the thing that really separates or distinguishes our group from many other groups doing this work in the city of Detroit is our belief and understanding that the most effective movements grow organically out of the people that they're designed to serve. We don't believe in folks from the outside our community coming in imposing things on our community. We welcome allyship and we welcome help. But when you help somebody, like for example, I wouldn't come to Lori's house and say, well, I want to help you, at your house. Get your house together. Oh, your house is real clean and organized, but so I wouldn't come into her house and say, well, put your shoes over here and we're going to move this couch over here. I would come in with some humility and I would say, well, Lori, how can I assist you? And I would follow her lead. But the reality is in North America, in the United States, I don't know if this is different in Canada, white people are not trained to follow the lead of black people. Straight up. And so that's a whole retraining thing that has to take place, right? So that's the difference of our group from many of the other groups, that our group has grown organically out of the community that is serving. We've lived there for many years. We've worked there. We're not doing this for somebody. We're doing it for ourselves, really. We're members of the community. So one of our early goals was to have a 2-acre organic farm. And this logic might be a little flawed, but at the time that we started, the kind of prevailing wisdom within the food community was that the difference between a garden and a farm was scale. And that if you had something at least two acres, that you could call it a farm. Again, that might be a little bit twisted logic, but that was our thinking at the time. So we wanted to make sure that we had at least 2 acres. So we had a location on the east side of Detroit in 2006, a 1/4 acre garden. And then in 2007, we moved to a second location. We had about a 1/2 acre. And that picture is from our 1/2 acre. Then in 2008, we moved to our current location, which is in a city-owned park. That's a long story. Maybe in the question and answer period, I can get into the trials and tribulations we went through to get this land in a city-owned park. But we have a 10-year license agreement for what has become the long-term home of D-Town Farm in the city of Detroit's Rouge Park. In 2011, we got an additional 5 acres added to our license agreement, making it a 7-acre farm, which makes it the largest of the many farms in the city of Detroit at this point in time. I love this picture, by the way, because many people give me all kind of excuses why they can't come out to the farm and get the work done. And so, I just point to that, okay? We grow more than 30 different fruits, vegetables, and herbs. I don't know if this is true. The lady that you see standing there is standing in one of our collard green fields. And I don't know if this is true, but people claim that in the city of Detroit that the collard greens from D-Town Farm are the sweetest collard greens in the city. So that, I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm willing to believe it. We also raise bees. Some people call this bee slavery, by the way. But we raise bees for pollination and for honey production. And that's our chief beekeeper, Abba Ifeoma. I never would have believed she'd be a beekeeper. Of all people in my life, she would be the last one I think would be handling bees, especially with no gloves or protective garments on. But she does it. She goes out there, she talks to them, she calls them her babies, and they have a relationship and an understanding, I suppose. We also grow mushrooms. We have large-scale composting. The compost bin that you see painted there was the most photographed compost bin in the city of Detroit. It's been painted over now. We started out with these small compost bins using pallets, using a model that we got from Will Allen and Growing Power in Milwaukee. But now we have a large-scale composting operation where we get about 8 to 10 tons of food waste every week that we mix with wood chips in order to produce this very rich compost. We have 3 hoop houses that we use for season extension. And so in November, you can see we have salad greens growing where you couldn't possibly grow them outside, unprotected in the ground in our climate. We do a robust agritourism trade. We have many people who visit our farm and are exposed to urban agriculture. We have hands-on learning opportunities for young people. And so for many young people, this is their introduction to farming. In fact, for many not so young people, we had a group of law students come out last year, and one of these law students from the University of Michigan said this was the first time he'd ever been to a farm. So this was a breakthrough for this person holding a worm, but as you can see, it was only a partial breakthrough because they still had on rubber gloves. And every year in September, we have a harvest festival where we have about 750 people that come out, and we have live music, and we have speakers, and we have food demonstrations, all kind of things. And part of this is to raise public awareness about the great potential of urban agriculture. Last year, we got water lines installed, which was a huge step forward because we were watering our crops with a fire hose. We now have solar panels that are being mounted in the next month or so, so we'll have some electricity at the farm. And we have a grant for a water harvesting system. We will be collecting water that accumulates on the low end of our farm each spring. We also serve as a regional outreach training center for growing power. And in fact, Utcha's husband, King Man, is in this picture somewhere. You see him? I figured you'd see him. So he came down and participated in this training where Will Allen and his staff from Growing Power came down and helped to build a hoop house. And so we get help building this hoop house. Folks get hands-on experience on how to do it. They get a chance to rub elbows with Will Allen. Everybody's happy. We sell primarily at farmers markets from June through October, and these are two of our kinds of kale that we grow. I never had kale till I was a grown man. I grew up eating mustards, collards, and turnips. I don't know about black folks in Canada, but in the United States, that's pretty much what we did. So when I discovered kale, I was like, wow. So we have a small staff, but a very enthusiastic staff, and we rely heavily on volunteers to do much of the work that we get done. So this is my contact information if you want to get in touch with us, and thank you. I hope I didn't take too much time. Peace.
Thanks, Malik. I don't think it's a problem that these presentations are longer than we originally were planning because they're so interesting. There's so much to learn. So we have Utcha next as our final speaker today, and Utcha is from right here in Toronto. And for those of you who know about FoodShare, you're going to learn lots of new interesting stuff. And for those who are being introduced to the work that FoodShare and Utcha have been doing, I think you're going to find it very interesting. So Andy here, who, by the way, thank you so much to Andy Lee, who is helping us with all the technical, don't know how I would do it without him. He's just setting up Utcha's presentation. So I'll tell you a little bit about Utcha. Utcha is the manager of food justice and community food animation at FoodShare, and she has over 15 years of experience in social justice activism work within communities of color and low-income communities, both on the local level and internationally. She's an international advisory board member of the Growing Food Justice Initiative, and which is the initiative that Erica Allen and Will Allen are heading up, who you heard about, based in Milwaukee. I'm sure she's going to be telling us a little bit about that. And that's an international organization that's leading the food justice movement globally to dismantle racism across food systems. She has education and employment background in the employment resource development and Afro-Caribbean studies, and she continues to support and advocate for marginalized communities with a big emphasis on growing equality and just local, national, and international food systems. So please welcome Utcha Sawyers.
So, karibu. I've just returned from, not just returned, but I've recently returned from Tanzania, where I had the opportunity of observing local farmers from a village in Karatu and the work that they're doing with Canadian Physicians for Aid and Relief. I'd like to begin by definitely acknowledging my ancestors and the shoulders that I stand on and all of us stand on as we do this great work. I want to pay particular homage to my mother, Lorna Richards, who is in the realm of the ancestors and my direct inspiration for the work that I do. I want to honor the elders that are here. So anyone 65 or 60 if you took early retirement or older. I want to honor you and acknowledge you and the work that you've done and you're continuing to do so that we can be here today and share our experiences and hopefully inspire change. I also want to acknowledge the communities that I work with. So I work with a variety of communities across the GTA, ranging from Malvern to Jane and Finch. I want to highlight a lot of the food security, food justice organizations that aren't often seen on the horizon of this revolution. So I want to acknowledge African Food Basket. I want to acknowledge the Thorncliffe Women's Collective. I also want to acknowledge the Black Farmers Collective, which is quickly emerging in Toronto. And I want to acknowledge the Three Sisters Aboriginal Soup Kitchens that I've been cultivating in Malvern. I'll let our IT person work on my presentation. And in the meanwhile, maybe I'll do a bit of a personal reflection. So as I mentioned, my mother, Lorna Richards, was a community gardener. She, the mother of all three of us, I'm the eldest of three. And you take for granted as a child the gifts that your parents give you. You oversee them because somehow as children we look to the world instead of our households for leadership. And I think it's a part of the culture here. We look to television, we look to our teachers, we look to, it's very easy to overlook family. And reflecting back, we always had a garden. I grew up in a TCH community in Scarborough, so initially at Markham and Eglinton, and then we moved to Gilder. And even though we had balconies, we always had what is called today container gardens. So those of you from the Caribbean may know the style of using tires, painting the tire, and then soiling. I think now people are using those to make money, right? But we had those on our balcony. And every summer we grew callaloo, we grew okra, we had thyme, we had tomato. These were things that were just common in our households. On our ledges, we always had, my mom is Trinidadian, so what we call Spanish thyme. What would you call it? Thick thyme. So it's that nice thick, when you walk by you can smell it. Sometimes people call it seasoning thyme, but we had that all across the ledge of our windowsill growing up. And it's really true, what you seed into a child at a young age is what they usually manifest, irregardless of the path that they may take, in the time in between time. And as I became a mother, I realized the importance of what we feed to our children, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. And I realized the importance of what we feed to children, especially children of color, being in, as Malik and Joseph so greatly expressed, a post, or moving towards a post-colonized community or society. And when I was about 26 about 25, my husband and I opened Amlakui Betaseb, which was an African-centered school. It was the first arts school, Afro-Caribbean arts and natural sciences school in Canada. We were the third Afro-Caribbean school or African-centered school in Toronto. So we followed in the footprints of Umoja Learning Circle and Senetu Ba'a. And we ran our school for about 8 years because my husband, being an educator in the TDSB system, saw how critical it was to have a space that nurtured young Afro-Caribbean children. Working in the west end of the city, he was often looked to and called upon in crisis situations. He was placed in schools because he was a Black male in the Jane and Finch community. And when he experiencing his day-to-day experiences really helped him to realize that there needed to be a safe space for communities and families to really hone and cultivate the young minds from the African Caribbean community. And in about 2009, we closed the school down. Some of you may know, the TDSB opened a public school, and with public school is free. And we were self-sustained, we built ourselves on the models of, and the principles of Marcus Garvey, so we really wanted to have our own money, generate our own current. We were not grant dependent. We fundraise and so on and so forth. When the TDSB school opened, we closed, and you were kind of faced with what are you going to do with the rest of your life, And fortunately, I had a relationship with FoodShare. I had taken part in an anti-poverty coalition work series that FoodShare had partnered with University of Toronto. Sorry, I've completely gone off my talk. Anyhow, coming back to FoodShare was a great experience for me because FoodShare is such a dynamic and unique organization. It's Canada's largest food security organization. We feed over 156,000 children every day through student nutrition programs. Our core programs are the Good Food Box, which some of you may be familiar with, a little green box, white writing. Some people use them for recycling. No. But these boxes go out to thousands of homes, over 5,000 homes every month. We also have Good Food Markets. We've recently launched a mobile market, which is a market on a bus. So we've retrofitted a bus that isolated communities can access food on a weekly basis. This bus drives into communities like Mornell Court, the Jane and Finch community. It also goes into communities like Kipling and Steeles that are isolated and known as food deserts, to deliver food to people who are isolated and have no access or limited access to food on a regular or daily basis. We also, as I mentioned before, through our student nutrition, have a student nutrition partnership with the City of Toronto, TDSB. It's a province, we have provincial support as well for this program. And this program looks at delivering meal programs, so your breakfast programs, snack programs, making sure that there's access to fresh and healthy food every day for each child participating in these programs. As I mentioned, there are over 156,000 children that are impacted by these programs. They also teach through the Field to Table Schools program food literacy, which is important. Malik brought up a really important point about not just growing food, but understanding how food affects your body. I think when children do not have the understanding of how things work, they're not interested in it. So if you can make learning about food fun, make it interactive, and make it, make it fun, make it interactive, and make it taste good. Children seem to adapt and get interested into food programming. So through Field to Table Schools, we've also animated various rooftop gardens that are engagement education spaces, and community small-scale gardens in school yards. Now, we also have an urban agriculture department that animates various community gardens across the city. So as I mentioned, my mom, who I'd like to get back to for one sec, my mom was a steward for Gordon Ridge Community's community garden. Gordon Ridge is the largest community garden in Toronto, and it's on TCH property, and it's served as a model for TCH communities. So we're currently working with TCH to develop a sister model, so community gardens across the TCH community that are mirror images of this garden. This garden has provided employment. It has provided a place of sanctuary for people who are isolated, for youth who are looking for summer jobs, and it's moving towards being a urban farm. So we're looking at the possibilities of growing it because there's about 3 acres of space on this property. We're looking at how we can mimic a similar model to what the D-Town group is doing at Gordon Ridge. And the hopes are that this will be replicable across the TCH community. Now, within the last few years, I've been at FoodShare for about the last 3 years, we've really been analyzing and looking at food justice, and in particular, food justice in Toronto. I remember having conversations with folks very early in just my experiences across the city and with the food systems networks. And I would hear a lot that it's an American issue. You know, as Malik mentioned, there is a different lens when you're coming from America or United States, and when we're experiencing injustice here in Toronto. And so immediately I identified that there is a critical need for us to really call this out. And not just, I think Joseph and I think Malik have done an excellent job of really breaking down what food justice is, but really looking at what are initiatives. There's two components. There's the activism, and then there is the action. And I really like the term actionism that Joseph, I'm gonna coin from Joseph. And I'd like to share with you today a lot of the action that is taking place to really increase the visibility of the food justice movement locally here in Toronto. So within FoodShare, we've currently gotten some fantastic news that we will be funded to develop a cross-cultural food access innovation hub. What this is it will be a platform for cross-cultural groups. So we're looking at communities of color, we're looking at newcomers to Canada, and we're looking at the Aboriginal community. These three groups will be supported to really develop their grassroots initiatives. So what we want to do is provide a safe space for emerging grassroots groups to really coin and hone their skill and to get direct support and counsel for their emerging projects, with the idea that eventually they have the choice to go on and develop as an organization. There is a severe need for Toronto to really increase the capacity of community-led groups. And we're very excited that we're going to be a platform for this to happen. A lot of people, when I share that we're focusing on these three groups, ask, well, why not just service everybody? I mean, there's a lot of, emerging grassroots groups. Why do you have to make it culturally specific or call out communities of color? And as a person that works firsthand across the city of Toronto, I know that through, many of the various, it's almost daily, I have conversations with folks who are so excited to have an opportunity because they feel unseen. They feel that when, like Malik said, you have these larger groups of organizations or even grassroots organizations that are not community-based come into your community, your ideas are kind of harvested. So has everybody heard of the community consultation process? Okay. So through community consultation processes, folks come to share their ideas. They want their communities to change. They want their voices to be heard. But unfortunately, at times, the ideas are harvested and they're not, the local community is not really acknowledged for the work that they've done. And we really have to change that landscape so that we are identifying key leaders, that we are acknowledging, especially youth. There are so many youth across the GTA who have been instrumental in keeping a lot of NGOs vibrant, keeping a lot of programs and initiatives around food access and food justice in continuum. But these youth are never or rarely identified. So this platform would definitely create a space where if a collective of youth were to come together and decide that they want to create a food access, and this can be community kitchens, this can be gardens, it can be distribution, whatever the food access innovation idea is, this platform would support them. So we're glad to say that this year we're starting off with 3 platform members that we'll be supporting the Black Farmers, Toronto Black Farmers Network. We'll be supporting the Thorncliffe Women's Neighborhood Committee, and we'll be supporting Three Sisters Aboriginal Soup Kitchen in Malvern. Every year, we will add 2 more groups to the platform. The idea is that the platform will host our platform members for 3 years, and then they will transition off. So, this is a model that FoodShare has been very successful in delivering in the past. Are any of you familiar with Not Far From the Tree? All right, so Not Far From the Tree was a part of our incubation process at FoodShare. The Toronto Bee Co-operative is a part of that incubation. There have been many groups that have sat on platforms and been directly supported by FoodShare, like AFB, and so on. So we want to make this official, and we want to make sure that we're creating direct support. And I think this is what is essential. We have to be very intentional with how we approach food justice, especially here in Toronto, because a lot of times the race gets watered down in diversity. And what I mean by that is that there are so many different isms and multiple levels of oppression within the social system that it's a lot easier to palette them together or put them together, cluster them together, and not look at the root issue. Look at root issues. So through this initiative, we plan to definitely use race as an opportunity and use this platform to move past racism and create a safe space for growing and emerging community-led food justice groups. As Lori mentioned, I do sit on the advisory of Growing Food Justice and For All initiative. And I'll just briefly mention that, last year was a very pivotal year for us here in Toronto. Toronto benefited from ILIFT training, which is a facilitation model that focuses on dismantling racism. So for 3 days at the Black Creek Community Farm, which is housed at Jane and Finch, we spent 3 days, between 70 and 80 people, on and off. Some people kind of went back and forth throughout the 3 days. We processed what is racism and how does it affect our local food movement, and how are we in Toronto going to stand as allies together to push forward an agenda that's equitable for all. And from this movement emerged the Toronto Black Farmers Network and Collective. And so we're very excited that this year we're going to hold another one, and we're making it at Black Creek a permanent staple in our summer programming. Black Creek Community Farm, just to acknowledge, is a farm led by Everdale Organic Farms out of Caledon, Ontario. And they've been in process with, and this is in partnership with African Food Basket, FoodShare, and Fresh City Farmers. These are the core partners. But the farm is in process in creating a food just growing space in the city. And I definitely see that in the next 3 to 5 years, this being a space that will be a model for how communities come together, process, and resolve issues to build an equitable food access space. The space is providing employment for the youth, the local youth of Jane and Finch. It's also providing leadership roles, so the farm is transitioning to be ran completely by the local community. And we're harvesting 6 acres of food each year. And the food is being sold at markets across the city and markets within the local community. So Driftwood community has a good food market, and the farm also sells at this market. It's important for us, again, to get back to being intentional, to have this activism or actionism, because we could stand up and we could talk a lot about what should be done, what has been done, where we should be, what we should be. But if we're not producing change, then we're just talking. And I know from experience that, from about 2005 was the first Growing Food Justice for All initiative. I remember years ago, I was a student of AFB, African Food Basket, and feeling like, why don't we have something like this for all communities? You know, why aren't there cross-cultural communities looking at food? It seemed like, just something that didn't exist. And so for Toronto, I think we need to be very, very intentional about making this happen. Very intentional about taking this dialogue and this conversation and making it into action. It's not enough for us to sit down and read books and talk about it, because those things are an important component. But it's important that as we go out into the world, that we understand the impact and the overall experience of people who are living in marginalized communities across the city, and I mean, across the province. As you see, Joseph shared so much about what's happening up north. I'd just like to close by sharing, one of our programs at FoodShare that really, it makes you proud to continue the work with the organization that you're working with. And it's a good food market. So we have these good food markets where we source food for local markets across the city. But this market is in Fort Albany. So our relationship with Joseph, it goes back. We actually send food by plane, by train, and by truck to Fort Albany because the food is so expensive in that community. A bag of flour is $60. They're buying food from the northern store that is rotten, and it's sitting on the shelves, and people are expected to eat this. And you would think all of these, miles and all of this carbon footprint, but the reality is that when the food arrives in Fort Albany, it's cheaper, and it's more affordable, it's fresher, and it's healthier than what they're expected to buy. And there are no alternatives. So again, I want to remind folks that this is a very critical and transitional paradigm shift that we're experiencing here in the city of Toronto. And it's very important that we're all playing an active and impactful role. Some people, and what I mean by that is we can pacify and feel like, okay, well, I bought from the market, and so I'm doing my part. And that's good, but what can you do to go beyond? If you're a person, if you're a Caucasian person and you feel that you're an ally and you've done the work to really introspect and reflect on how your work, or how you contribute, or how you want to be an ally to the local community, how do you action that? Is it by smiling and maybe patroning, a local good food market or a community market or a community youth project? Or are you using that power and that privilege to sway and change and make a way, as Will Allen would say, kind of step aside and make a current so that people can come forward and make the change that they need to see. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time. And I'd like to thank Lori for having us here today, and Joseph for coming in, even though he's expecting his baby. And all of you for taking the time to listen to our talk today.
Thank you so much, Utcha. So we've had 3 terrific presentations, 3 great examples of actionism. I love that term as well. And I hope that we at New College can also contribute in our way to actionism in making change in the food movement. We're coming to the end of the official time. We had this, the schedule was to go on till 9 o'clock. Would people like to ask a few questions? We have the room for a little bit longer. So if there are a couple of questions, we can take those before we wrap up. Anyone want to have a question? Okay, well, what we'll do is we're going to be here for about a half an hour more, and we have I think there's still a little bit of food over there and maybe some coffee and tea. But before we finish off, you've heard mention of Anon Lololi several times throughout the evening. And Anon is one of the leaders as well, great leaders and thinkers of the food justice movement here in Toronto. And he's sitting right over there. And I would like to invite Anon. He's the executive director of the African Food Basket, and he's been working on food sovereignty issues for a long time and contributed not just in Canada but internationally. So I'd like to invite Anon to come and say an official thank you to our speakers today.
Thank you very much, Laurie, and I'm glad to be here. Glad to see the turnout. I was so pleased to hear when my good brother Malik spoke about patriarchy, and my sister over there was clapping with a lot of passion. Toronto, we need to have more passion when there are important words are being spoken, because it's a very important note that Malik bring forward, that is not directly related to food and it's not directly related to race. But it's important for us to feel that experience. And I appreciate your enthusiasm very much. Could you give a round of applause? Yes. What race got to do with it? Race is a part, as Malik said, part of everything that we do. We've been cultured to look at most things through a Eurocentric lens. A lot of the conversation we heard from the different presenters had that cultural component of how we perceive the food system. Joseph's presentation focused a lot around the community co-op of the First Nations. Malik spoke about self-reliance, about folks in Detroit making sure that they experience Kuji Jakulia. And it's to be self-determining, to be self-reliant, to make sure that the food system reflects the people. Because, you know, food is such an important, I would like to say food is the single most important thing to human being other than their relationship with the Almighty. Food is very, very important. That's why I was so pleased to see these brothers have a seed library. This is very innovative. This is like, trust me, from my experience, to see this stuff come out of Toronto make me feel good to be a Torontonian, because we're doing a lot of work within this food system. But food justice has played a very important part in our work. And it's good to see FoodShare hire food justice manager, because living in the most multicultural city in the world, we have a lot to show the world. You know, when we look at what's happening in Crimea and the relationship with Russia and Ukrainian, that's going to be the problems of the future, how we get along. And food justice is about how we get along. So when we talk about what race have to do with it, it has everything to do with it. We have to understand race. Like, I'm having a conversation earlier with Wayne, and we talk about how urban agriculture could really reorient people of African descent to don't look at farming as slavery. Now, there's a real experience for people of African descent. To be able to live through an experience of 300 years. You get up in the morning, you go to the farm, you farm till about the evening, and you come home, and you do it over and over again. It be a part of the psychological makeup of individuals. Like from my experience, I come from Guyana traditionally, and after slavery, most of the people of African descent wanted to be a civil servant, police officer, prison warder, because they don't have anything to do with food. They don't have anything to do with farming. But farming and food is so important, as the three presenters put forward, that we have to move past that. We have to move past that experience of slavery and know that we gotta be self-reliant and we gotta farm. And it's good to hear the work FoodShare doing in encouraging new projects. Now, the food basket was always an independent institution and not incubated by FoodShare, we had a reciprocal relationship of development. And it's very important to know that, because when we're done with self-determination, that was the focus. There could be a relationship, and we want to see more of these relationships established. The program in Albany, Fort Albany, that is so interesting, because we want to make sure that we can empower communities to be food secure. So overall, when we talk about the First Nations program, and we look at, trying to look at my notes, we look at the subsidization of farmers in Canada. And we have people living up north who play a very important part in the Turtle Island, who existence have us being here. Because suppose they didn't have colonization. Suppose this was still originally the First Nations people land. It's a whole different ballgame for the whole world. So what North and South America has done for the world is very important. So supporting projects like the Northern Co-op, let me get it right, the True North Co-op, that should be a priority, just like how it's a priority to subsidize Canadian farmers. When we're talking about what are the priorities, we got to make sure that we have the right priorities. Fast food impact on the health of First Nations communities. Fast food impact on the world, because we're turning into an obese world with all these chemicals and all these wealth accumulated strategies through junk food. We got to get rid of that. We got to make sure we have policy. You agree with me? We have to have policies to get rid of that, because we're spending more money on health when we're supposed to be spending the money in the right way to make sure people live healthy. They mean eating healthy foods. The economics of the co-op structure. I always reflect on First Nations people and African people that they don't have a capitalist bone within the system, as Malik was saying. Because capitalism, it's such a destructive system. Now, we live in it, and we live in through the benefits of it. But that doesn't mean we're a part of it. We have to be active, and we have to talk about it. To make sure we develop a more just world, we want to make sure we have a system of cooperative development. So that when we look at the different types of systems of development, we could see the world needs a co-op structure. The world needs a structure that could make sure we develop together. Make sure we develop the knowledge of how we could have a more sustainable economic system. Like the Blueberry Project, you know, looking at the development of young people. One of the key ideas that flow through the presentations is about the centering of individual cultures. Malik spoke of it, about the African-centered, and Patrick also spoke a bit of how First Nations people are centering themselves. Because when you look at global white supremacy, you get to be afraid. You get to be afraid about you living on a system that you can't think for yourself. We want to make sure people could have their own ideas, so that we have a world where we have more the diversity of ideas spreading. That's why I always like to come out to Toronto. We have a unique opportunity to shape a lot of ideas of how the world be, because the world is looking at Toronto for an example of how people can live together in love and unity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anand, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. And please help us finish up the food and see what some of the exciting projects are. And I'm sure that our guests would be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks so much, and thanks to the folks in Thunder Bay. Thank you, Joseph, and hope that you heard us well. And I'm really pleased everything worked out. Thanks so much. Good night.